The sun was high in the sky, blazing down on the village square with a harsh light that seemed to spotlight every flaw, every fear, every shame. She was dragged forward, her arms bound loosely, but enough to remind her that resistance would be punished. Her knees met the rough stone ground with a jolt, sending splinters of pain up her legs. The crowd had already gathered, villagers spilling out from every doorway and alley, faces twisted with anticipation, curiosity, and the cruel delight that comes from the spectacle of another's suffering. They called her names she had heard whispered before, but now spoken aloud with laughter and mockery. Wretched child. Weak one. Bow to the judgment of those stronger than you. The words echoed against the walls, bouncing from one side of the square to the other. Each taunt pressed down on her, heavier than the shackles on her wrists, heavier than the iron chains they had once thought could restrain her spirit. She lowered her gaze, trying to make herself smaller, to shrink into the cracks between the stones, to disappear entirely. But no matter how she positioned herself, the crowd's eyes held her captive. Mothers clutched their children and nudged them forward to watch, curious about the girl who had dared defy some unspoken law or broken a rule she barely understood. The elders, seated upon wooden benches carved with ancient designs, nodded at each other as if confirming the narrative they had already constructed. She was guilty, and her punishment would be a lesson for all who might question their authority. Yet among the crowd someone did not join the laughter. A figure remained in the shadows, their eyes fixed on her. They were subtle, careful, yet their attention carried weight. While the villagers were swept up in the performative act of condemnation, this witness watched in silence, recording everything: the shove of the guards, the tilt of her shoulders, the way her fingers trembled against the stones. They noticed the way her eyes, though lowered, still sparkled with something the crowd could not see: the faint pulse of resilience, the quiet defiance beneath her bowed posture. The girl felt every whisper, every snicker, every pointed finger. The humiliation stung, raw and public, yet something deep inside her refused to break. She could feel the heat of the sun on her skin, the sting of dirt beneath her knees, the scorn of those around her, but she also felt a faint, almost imperceptible presence nearby. Something watched, something new. It was not the villagers. It was someone, or something, that saw beyond the performance, beyond the cruelty, beyond the chains and accusations. The guards gripped her shoulders to keep her kneeling, leaning in as if to emphasize the lesson, to ensure she felt the full weight of the village's judgment. Yet her mind, despite the sharp sting of shame, began to clear. Each word hurled at her became less a weapon and more a marker of truth. They believed themselves strong. They believed themselves in control. And in their arrogance, they failed to notice the spark flickering quietly within her, a spark that no humiliation, no chains, no mockery could extinguish. She forced herself to breathe slowly, feeling her chest rise and fall, sensing the rhythm of her own heartbeat beneath the chaos. Somewhere in the crowd, the silent witness adjusted slightly, leaning forward, eyes narrowing, lips pressing together in concentration. They understood something the villagers did not: that the girl on her knees was not defeated, that the story was far from over. And though the crowd roared and jeered, her spirit, invisible to all but that single observer, began to stir. A storm of patience, awareness, and quiet determination gathered within her chest. The villagers had chosen this moment to display power, to assert dominance, but unseen in the shadows, the balance had already begun to shift. She remained kneeling, outwardly submissive, but inside she was preparing. Each humiliation, each insult, each jeer was a seed for what was to come. And somewhere, just beyond the reach of the mocking eyes, a witness waited, knowing full well who should bow and who, in time, would command respect. Hidden in the shadows of a narrow alley, away from the central square where the village gathered, the observer watched intently. Their eyes traced every movement: the girl's bowed head, the guard's harsh grips, the villagers' gleeful expressions. They had arrived early, unnoticed, blending into the corners, carrying nothing but knowledge and a quiet resolve. No one suspected their presence, for they had learned long ago how to be invisible when it mattered most. The observer's mind raced as they took in the scene. They were not a stranger entirely. Some in the village recognized them, yet few paid attention to their presence, dismissing them as an old elder, a wandering spirit, or simply someone who preferred silence to participation. Tonight, that silence would be their instrument. They saw what no one else dared to acknowledge: the girl kneeling in the square was not weak. She was not guilty. She was misunderstood, misjudged, and at this moment, publicly humiliated for a crime she had not committed. Each time a villager's hand rose to point or their voice shouted insults, the observer flinched slightly, though outwardly they remained still. Inside, however, a fire began to burn, not of anger for the girl's sake, but of recognition for the truth, for the injustice the villagers failed to see. They had watched many acts of cruelty, many moments of unfairness, but something about this child was different. Perhaps it was the spark in her eyes, the way her spine, though bowed, refused to bend entirely, or the subtle tremor of hands that hinted at nerves unbroken by fear. The observers' attention sharpened as they noticed small details overlooked by the crowd. The guards' hands were not merely firm, they were impatient, anxious. Some villagers exchanged glances, uneasy, sensing the wrongness but unsure why. Even in their laughter, a ripple of uncertainty ran like a shadow beneath the surface. And through it all, the kneeling girl maintained a rhythm in her breathing, deliberate and calm, as though she had already begun preparing for something unseen, something beyond the immediate humiliation. A breeze swept through the square, rustling the edges of garments, scattering loose straw, carrying faint scents from the surrounding fields. The observer saw her lift her chin fractionally, almost imperceptibly, as if acknowledging the wind's encouragement. The crowd did not notice, too enraptured by their own mockery, but the witness saw everything. They recognized the subtle signals: resilience in posture, clarity in thought, the quiet defiance that cannot be silenced by force alone. The observer knew their role was not to intervene openly, at least not yet. This moment had to be seen in full, the tension allowed to stretch until the critical point arrived. They would act when the balance shifted, when the crowd's confidence began to falter, when the girl herself reached the inner threshold of her awakening. Until then they would remain a silent record, a guardian of truth, a witness to injustice. As the laughter and shouts rose, the observer's mind wandered briefly to the history of the village, to the times when the innocent had been punished, when power had been abused, and when the strong had overlooked subtle truths. They had witnessed the consequences, the ripple of fear and guilt left behind in such acts. And they knew, in this case, that the story would be different. If only the girl was allowed to rise and the timing of the intervention was precise. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours. Every shout, every gesture, every jeer was catalogued in the observer's mind. They felt the weight of responsibility settle on their shoulders, a responsibility to ensure that truth would not be buried in the noise of mockery. They sensed the turning point approaching, though the villagers were blissfully unaware. The kneeling girl shivered slightly in the heat, adjusting her position, unaware of the unseen presence that watched over her. And the witness, for the first time in many years, felt hope, the faint, unshakable certainty that someone, somewhere, could see beyond fear and cruelty, could recognize what the villagers refused to see. They knew who should bow and who should command respect. And they would wait for the moment when the world finally acknowledged it. Silently, invisibly, the witness remained, keeping watch over the child who would not remain a victim, knowing that history had already begun to turn in her favor. Even as her knees pressed against the unforgiving stone, she began to notice something strange. Beneath the weight of humiliation, beneath the harsh jeers and mocking laughter, there was a faint, almost imperceptible sound, like a whisper threading through the air, soft but insistent. It was not carried by any mouth, not spoken by any villager. It seemed to arise from the very atmosphere, from the shadows that clung to the edges of the square, from the trembling of the earth beneath her. At first she thought it was a trick of her mind, a tremor caused by fear and exhaustion. But as the whispers persisted, she realized they were deliberate, meaningful, guiding her attention to a place within herself she had almost forgotten existed. Her heart, which had hammered with dread moments ago, began to slow, sinking with the rhythm of the subtle murmurs. The whispers were faint, almost like the wind brushing across a chime, yet unmistakably there, encouraging her, calling her to stand even when her body refused. "Lift your head," the voice seemed to say. "You are stronger than you know. Your spirit cannot be bowed by those who mistake cruelty for power." She drew in a trembling breath and obeyed, ever so slightly, raising her chin just a fraction. The crowd did not notice, of course. Their attention was elsewhere, reveling in the drama of her forced kneeling. But she felt it, a small ember of courage flickering inside her chest. The whispers were no longer distant. They resonated within her, echoing through her bones, reminding her of the strength she had always carried but had been too afraid to acknowledge. Her fingers dug into the cold stone, gripping as if to anchor herself in this new awareness. The words continued to flow, silent but clear, shaping her thoughts, lifting the veil of fear that had clouded her mind for so long. Each insult thrown by the villagers now seemed less like a weapon and more like a challenge, one she was beginning to accept not with defiance, but with deliberate clarity. "You do not belong beneath their scorn," the whispers said. Rise, and they will know the truth of who commands the earth beneath their feet. She could almost see them, these words, twisting and forming into shapes around her. A faint shimmer of light seemed to pulse just beyond the crowd's vision, subtle yet undeniable. It pressed against her consciousness, urging her forward, guiding her through the suffocating weight of public humiliation. For the first time in what felt like years, she understood that courage was not the absence of fear, it was the decision to move despite it. Her breath deepened, steadying herself. She imagined the villagers' eyes on her, not as instruments of shame, but as witnesses to a choice being made, that she would no longer be merely the subject of their mockery. She would become the owner of her own story, the arbiter of her own power. And in that imagining, the whispers grew stronger, more insistent, almost tangible, weaving around her like a protective cloak. A shift rippled through the crowd, almost imperceptible. Some villagers noticed the slight lift of her chin, the subtle straightening of her back, and felt a momentary confusion. The power dynamics, once assumed, began to tremble. Fear began to seep into the faces of those who had thought themselves untouchable, though they could not yet name why. The whispers continued, persistent, urging her to claim the space around her, to let her presence be seen even in stillness. You are not weak. You are not small. The world bends to no one's scorn, but yours can rise to command it. And she felt it, a spark, a heartbeat of courage igniting within her chest. A quiet, steadfast certainty that no matter the jeers, no matter the chains of expectation, she had power that the villagers could neither recognize nor contain. Each beat of her heart strengthened that certainty, and the whispers, the invisible encouragement, seemed to grow louder, more vibrant, suffusing her being with the knowledge that she could stand, fully, unapologetically, at the right moment. Though she remained kneeling, outwardly subdued, she knew that inside, a revolution had begun. The whispers of courage had taken root, a seed of defiance and self-recognition that no one could uproot. And somewhere in the shadows, the silent witness nodded ever so slightly, understanding that the girl who seemed defeated had already begun to rise, first in spirit, then inevitably in presence. For the first time she realized, the moment of her true power was coming, and no force, mockery, chains, or fear could stop it. The villagers' laughter rolled across the square, harsh and unrelenting, filling the air with an oppressive weight that pressed down on her shoulders. Mothers held their children back with tight grips, fearing the intensity of the scene but unable to look away. Merchants paused their trades, leaning over carts to watch, while elders murmured to each other, approving the public lesson they had deemed necessary. Every sound, every gesture, every pointed finger was designed to remind her, and anyone who might think to follow her example, that obedience was demanded, defiance punished. They circled her like wolves, taking turns throwing words like stones. Weakling. Kneel longer. Learn your place, they jeered. Some spat to emphasize their contempt, others laughed so hard their faces reddened. Her knees burned against the cold stones, her fingers pressed raw against the earth, yet she kept her head down, outwardly submissive. The humiliation stung with every heartbeat, yet inside, a small flame of awareness had begun to burn, growing brighter with each insult. The mocking was deliberate, ritualistic almost, an act rehearsed over generations to keep the weak in their place. They relished the spectacle, confident that the display of power was absolute. Every villager who had ever doubted authority, every whisper of rebellion, was drowned out by this orchestrated denouncement. And yet, amidst this chaos, a single pair of eyes followed every move, the silent witness. The observer remained hidden, leaning slightly from the edge of a shadowed archway, taking in the scene with unflinching calm. They saw what the villagers refused to see. The girl's body might have been pressed to the ground, her back bowed, but her mind and spirit were already moving beyond the square, beyond the jeers, beyond the control of those who thought themselves rulers of her fate. She was not broken. She was calculating, absorbing, understanding the mechanics of fear and power. Some villagers noticed subtle inconsistencies, how she did not tremble entirely, how her fingers clenched not in surrender but in quiet determination. A few felt unease creep into their laughter, though none could pinpoint its source. The mockery continued, relentless, but its effect was no longer absolute. The girl's presence, though still kneeling, began to radiate something different, a latent power that unsettled the proud, a subtle defiance that could not be broken by words alone. The elders, seated on benches carved from centuries-old wood, exchanged nods and murmurs, believing the lesson had been properly delivered. Yet even they felt an inexplicable tension, a faint disturbance in the air they could not explain. Their voices, which had carried authority for decades, seemed suddenly hollow against the backdrop of the girl's hidden resolve. The observer's gaze shifted as small signs began to appear: the slight lift of her chin, the controlled breath, the steady heartbeat that radiated in rhythm with the whispers only she could hear. These were not accidents. These were the first tremors of a shift the villagers could neither perceive nor understand. The girl's outward submission was a mask, carefully maintained, while her spirit expanded quietly, imperceptibly, like roots spreading beneath frozen soil. Laughter and taunts continued, but they began to falter in subtle ways. Some of the mockers hesitated mid-gesture, others' voices wavered, betraying a crack in the confidence they had worn like armor. The observer recognized the moment, understanding that this was the first stage of reversal. The crowd's perception of absolute control had begun to weaken, even if only slightly. Her knees ached, her hands scraped raw, yet every shout, every jeer, every scornful look became fuel. The crowd believed they were victorious, but their ignorance blinded them to the silent transformation taking place. The girl who had been forced to kneel was not defeated. She was awakening, gathering strength from the very contempt meant to break her. Somewhere in the shadows, the silent witness allowed a faint smile, knowing the moment of reckoning was drawing nearer. The villagers could mock all they wanted, yet they had unknowingly chosen to display their weakness before the very force they sought to suppress. And in that realization, the balance of power, long assumed to be theirs, had begun to shift imperceptibly, but irrevocably. As the jeers and laughter of the villagers continued to swirl around her, a subtle change began to ripple through the square. It was not obvious, not to anyone but her and the silent witness who had been observing every moment. The air itself seemed to respond to her inner pulse, vibrating faintly with a rhythm that matched her own heartbeat. It was a sensation she had never felt before, a quiet resonance that hinted at a hidden strength lying dormant within her. For years she had been told she was weak, too delicate, too timid, too insignificant to matter. But now, kneeling in the harsh glare of ridicule, she felt the first flickers of something else. A presence rising from deep within her chest, coiling like a living entity ready to stretch and claim its space. She didn't fully understand it, could not name it yet, but it made her aware of the cracks in the villagers' confidence, the subtle tremors of unease that even they could not identify. Her eyes flickered up, meeting those of the crowd with the faintest glimmer of awareness, and in that instant, a shift began. The shadows near her stirred as if alive, brushing against her back, circling around her knees, whispering in tones only she could hear. It was as if the ground beneath her recognized her, as if the stones themselves, worn by centuries of village footsteps, had begun to hum with anticipation. A breeze stirred out of nowhere, not warm, not cold, but sharp enough to rustle the edges of garments and stray leaves on the square. The villagers looked around, confusion flickering across their faces. No one could tell the source. Their attention returned to her, the girl who had knelt obediently, but now they noticed a subtle change. Something about her presence demanded attention, a latent authority that had been invisible until now. She focused, sensing the energy, feeling it coil and shift beneath her ribs. Her fists clenched against the stones, not in submission but in preparation. The whispers around her grew stronger, more insistent, urging her to recognize her own capability. And for the first time she understood that power does not always roar, it can wait, patient and quiet, until the right moment reveals it. The villagers felt it too, though they could not identify it. A faint tension crept into the laughter of the crowd, a hesitation that spread like frost through their confidence. They exchanged uncertain glances, feeling without understanding that something was amiss. The mockery that had seemed so effortless only moments before now felt heavier, awkward, as though the girl they had sought to shame was no longer simply kneeling at their mercy. The silent witness, watching from the shadows, exhaled slowly, sensing the moment of potential. They saw it, the first glimpse of her true power, not violent, not overt, but undeniable in its subtle presence. Her spine straightened fractionally, her head lifted a little higher, her awareness sharpened to a point that could slice through the arrogance of the crowd. The villagers' certainty that they controlled her began to waver, and the witness knew this was the beginning of the reversal, the start of the reckoning that would come. Even as the sun bore down on her shoulders, even as her knees scraped against the stone, she felt the first thrill of control, not over the villagers but over herself. The energy coursing within her did not demand spectacle. It demanded recognition, a quiet acknowledgement that she could no longer be overlooked. She could feel it shaping her thoughts, guiding her movements, hinting at a possibility she had never dared to imagine, that she could rise, that she could reclaim what had been denied her. The crowd noticed the faint shimmer that danced across the edges of her form, subtle enough to be dismissed by some, yet enough to prick at the minds of the more perceptive. Children paused mid-whisper, merchants froze with half-raised hands, and elders frowned, sensing the unnatural aura but unable to articulate the unease. Even the guards hesitated for the briefest of moments, their grip loosening as if the air itself resisted them. In that moment she understood, the laughter and mockery were not the measure of power. The true test was the quiet awakening within, the knowledge that even unseen, even underestimated, her presence could ripple outward, affecting the world around her. And as she lifted her chin just a fraction more, a whisper reached her ears again, gentle, guiding, and full of promise. It said simply, "You are not as small as they believe. Not for long." And in that whisper she felt the surge of possibility, the glimpse of power that would soon demand recognition, the first step toward a world where the roles of observer and observed, oppressor and oppressed, would be irrevocably reversed. The silent witness shifted slightly in the shadows, eyes narrowing as they studied the girl kneeling in the square. They had watched for hours, cataloging every insult hurled at her, every shove of the guards, every ripple of laughter that cascaded through the crowd. The whispers that had begun to stir inside her had not gone unnoticed. The witness could feel the energy radiating from her, subtle yet undeniable, like heat from a hidden fire. But witnessing was not enough. They needed to test her to see if the spark could endure under true pressure, if it could grow from ember to flame. The witness had chosen this method carefully. Any overt intervention would ruin the lesson, would rob the girl of the awareness she was beginning to claim. The challenge would be quiet, subtle, almost invisible to the villagers, but potent enough to force her to confront herself. The witness reached inward, drawing upon the hidden knowledge that had allowed them to remain unseen and vigilant for so many years. They created small disturbances in the environment, leaves shifting in impossible directions, faint creaks of unseen movement, shadows that lingered where they should not. The girl noticed immediately, though she did not yet understand why. The subtle anomalies made her pulse quicken, a blend of fear and exhilaration that sharpened her senses. She recognized the presence, the quiet force that had been watching her from the start, and it drew her attention inward. Her mind cleared amid the chaos, her awareness heightened as if the disturbances were signals, tests she was meant to interpret. She lifted her head a fraction higher, eyes scanning the crowd, feeling the rhythm of her own heartbeat synchronize with the subtle patterns in the square. The whispers that had begun to awaken within her were louder now, resonating with the unseen guidance of the witness. They urged her not to act rashly, to observe, to understand, to recognize her own capability before attempting anything outwardly. The challenge was not simply to endure the humiliation, it was to see beyond it, to connect the inner strength with the external world. The villagers remained unaware of the subtle manipulations. They continued their mockery, oblivious to the faint tremor of fear creeping into the bravado of their laughter. Some shifted uneasily, feeling the unnatural weight in the air, though they could not explain it. The guards, confident in their authority, tightened their grips on her arms, but even they felt a strange resistance emanating from her. Something was changing and no one present could yet name what it was. The girl closed her eyes briefly, focusing on the inner flame that had begun to stir. She felt the air around her pulse and shift, felt the subtle echoes of movement that were not of the villagers. Her body relaxed, even as her posture remained kneeling. She understood now that the challenge was not to fight the visible cruelty, but to master the unseen currents that had begun to respond to her presence. The whispers and disturbances were teaching her control, discipline, and awareness, the qualities she would need to transform potential into action. The witness watched carefully, noting her reactions. Every micro-expression, every subtle shift in posture, every slight increase in confidence was recorded in their mind. They saw the quiet determination taking root, the way she processed the anomalies without panic, and the spark of understanding that even in the midst of humiliation, she had agency. It was not an easy test. Each insult, each shove, each pointed finger was magnified by the presence of the unseen manipulations, designed to push her to the edge without breaking her. But she held, and in doing so she began to internalize the first real lesson, that power was not always loud, that courage could be quiet, and that observation and understanding could be as potent as force. The witness allowed a small smile, satisfied that the test was working. The girl had begun to see, to feel, and to respond. The challenge of the witness was not to intervene or save her, it was to guide her to the threshold of her own awakening, preparing her for the moment when she would rise and the villagers would finally recognize what they had underestimated. And in the shadows, the witness waited patiently, knowing that when the time came, the lesson would be complete, and the girl kneeling before the jeering crowd would no longer be merely a victim. The moment arrived almost without warning. The villagers, drunk on their own mockery, had allowed themselves a brief lapse in attention. Their laughter echoed across the square, loud and careless, as if they owned every sound, every movement, every heartbeat of the girl kneeling before them. But she had been listening, watching, feeling the subtle patterns in the air, and the whispers inside her had grown stronger, more insistent, guiding her toward a decision she had not dared to make before. She lifted her head deliberately, letting her eyes sweep across the crowd. For the first time she did not look down in submission, did not avert her gaze in fear. She looked directly at those who had mocked her for years, the merchants, the elders, the guards, even the children who had echoed their laughter, and she saw them clearly, not as authority figures, not as monsters, but as flawed humans, their confidence fragile, their power dependent on her obedience. A faint, almost imperceptible tremor ran through the square as the villagers sensed the shift. Some laughed nervously, unsure why the sight of her lifted chin unsettled them so deeply. Others leaned forward, confused, trying to regain the dominance they had so carelessly assumed. Her knees ached, her hands pressed raw against the stone, yet the discomfort was drowned out by the awareness that she had the capacity to act, to claim even a small measure of control in this moment of public humiliation. She straightened her back just a fraction, and with the slightest lift of her fingers, she sent a subtle ripple through the air. Leaves stirred, dust shifted in spirals, and shadows, previously static, twisted toward her like obedient servants. The villagers did not yet recognize it as power, but the moment had arrived. She was no longer entirely subject to their will. The silent witness, hidden in the shadows, allowed a faint smile, recognizing the first deliberate act of defiance, small yet monumental. Her voice, when it came, was soft, almost delicate, but it cut through the din of mockery with precision. "I will not bow to fear," she said, not loudly, not triumphantly, but with the quiet authority of someone who had discovered their own strength. The words were simple, but their effect was immediate. The villagers froze mid-laugh, their eyes widening as they sensed something shifting beneath the surface, something that defied explanation. A guard stepped forward, hand raised as if to force her back into submission, but the air between them seemed to resist, charged with an energy he could not comprehend. His fingers trembled, his stance faltered, and for the first time, he realized that the girl before him was no longer merely a passive object. She had begun to move, slowly, deliberately, even as she remained kneeling, and the tiny act of defiance radiated outward, unsettling the balance of power that had once seemed absolute. The villagers exchanged confused glances, murmuring to each other in disbelief. The confidence that had allowed them to mock, to control, to humiliate began to crack. Even the most arrogant among them felt a strange unease, a prickling sensation that their dominance was not as solid as they had believed. The girl's small, deliberate movements, guided by the whispers and by the hidden witness, had already begun to rewrite the rules of the square. She raised her chin slightly higher, allowing a strand of hair to fall free, unbound, almost defiantly brushing against her shoulder. The whispers inside her cheered silently, encouraging, guiding, feeding the growing awareness that she could influence the world around her, even if subtly, even if quietly. The act was small, imperceptible to most, yet monumental in effect. A declaration that obedience was no longer automatic, that fear could be resisted, that even the weakest could hold their ground when guided by courage and insight. The silent witness exhaled, satisfied. The first act of defiance had been completed, and it had set the stage for what was to come. They knew that the girl kneeling in the square was awakening, her latent power responding to the challenges, her mind sharpening, her spirit expanding. And though the villagers could not yet see it, the tide had begun to turn. The balance of power, long assumed, had shifted imperceptibly, and the first spark of reckoning had ignited. Even as the crowd continued to murmur and shuffle, she remained kneeling, outwardly submissive, yet inwardly transformed. The first act of defiance was not loud, it was not violent. It was a seed planted in the hearts of all who watched, a quiet warning that the girl they had mocked would no longer be contained, and that the true measure of strength was only beginning to reveal itself. The moment after her first act of defiance rippled through the square like the quiet beginning of a storm. Though the villagers did not understand what had shifted, the air itself seemed to pulse with tension, vibrating in ways that made even the loudest mockers hesitate. The whispers inside her had grown stronger, insistent now, guiding her awareness outward, tuning her senses to the subtle currents around her. She could feel the invisible threads of energy weaving through the crowd, connecting each person, each motion, each breath, and she began to understand that she could influence these currents if she chose. The wind picked up unexpectedly, curling around the edges of the square, tugging at the hems of garments, scattering leaves across the stones. The villagers glanced at each other, unease flickering in their eyes. Merchants paused mid-trade, children froze mid-laugh, and even the elders' murmurs faltered. None of them knew the source of the change. They only sensed that the balance of power, once assumed to be theirs, was no longer absolute. She closed her eyes briefly, drawing the energy inward, letting the whispers guide her. Each insult, each shove, each sneer she had endured now fed into her awareness, concentrated into a quiet but formidable force. The first act of defiance had awakened a spark, but the gathering storm was more than mere courage. It was a connection to something ancient, something that had watched over her bloodline for generations. The whispers reminded her of the lessons, the guidance she had received in silence. Observation before action, awareness before confrontation, patience before revelation. Her fingers flexed against the stone floor, and the faintest tremor ran along the cobblestones beneath her palms. It was almost imperceptible, yet those attuned even slightly could feel it. The villagers shifted uneasily, some brushing the sensation off as coincidence, others sensing a disturbance they could not explain. Even the guards who had once held her down felt the subtle pressure, a vibration in the air that resisted their authority, that hinted at power beyond their comprehension. As she knelt there, the wind grew stronger, whistling softly through the square. It carried faint sounds, rustling leaves, the distant caw of birds, the shuffle of the villagers' feet, but the noises seemed to speak a pattern, a rhythm that only she could understand. Each movement of the crowd, each gasp, each nervous glance became part of a symphony she could read, anticipate, and respond to. The storm was gathering, not in the skies above, but within the very fabric of the square, within the currents that connected all who were present. The silent witness in the shadows watched intently, noting every micro-expression, every subtle tremor of the crowd, every flicker of comprehension on her face. They had guided her this far, but now the responsibility shifted slightly. She had begun to understand the language of power, of influence, of unseen forces. The witness did not intervene. They simply observed, knowing that the storm she was gathering would be her own, shaped by her choices, her awareness, and her courage. The villagers were unaware of the brewing storm, yet they felt its presence as a subtle pressure against their confidence. They continued their taunts, but their voices faltered, their gestures slowed, their laughter carried an edge of uncertainty. Even those who had laughed the loudest felt a chill they could not name, an awareness that something beyond their comprehension was at work. The storm had no visible form yet, but its energy hummed palpably, and the girl kneeling at its center was the eye of it, calm, focused, and aware. She lifted her chin just slightly, feeling the currents respond to the rising awareness within her. The whispers urged her forward, not to attack, not to dominate, but to recognize the power she already carried, the subtle ability to influence, to reshape the perceptions of those around her. Every insult and every shove had been absorbed, converted into energy, focused not outward in recklessness but inward in clarity. The storm was ready to break. The first acts of defiance had been small tremors, but now the pattern was clear. The villagers' arrogance had created the conditions, the whispers had guided her understanding, and the quiet force within her was coalescing into something undeniable. The air around the square vibrated with anticipation, a prelude to the reckoning that would soon follow. She remained kneeling, outwardly submissive, yet her awareness had transformed the very atmosphere. The gathering storm whispered her name, promising that when it broke, the villagers would learn finally the cost of mockery, the weight of underestimation, and the power hidden in the most unlikely heart. The first crack of thunder rolled across the sky as if summoned by the tension coiling within the square. The villagers looked up instinctively, their laughter faltering, their confidence slipping. They had mocked her for years, called her weak, fragile, unworthy, yet the air itself now whispered that their assumptions were about to be shattered. Every sound seemed sharper, every shadow darker, and every subtle breeze carried a warning they could not comprehend. The girl, kneeling at the center of the square, felt the culmination of the power that had been quietly building within her. Her heartbeat matched the rhythm of the unseen currents, each pulse sending ripples of energy outward. The whispers had grown into a chorus, guiding her hands, her breath, her very presence. She no longer felt fear or uncertainty, she felt purpose, focus, and the undeniable truth that her strength was hers alone to command. With a deliberate motion, she raised her hands slightly, and the wind responded. It swept through the square, playful at first, rustling clothes and scattering loose leaves. The villagers gasped, looking around frantically trying to find the source, but the movement was too fluid, too sudden, and impossible to trace. The more she focused, the more the storm seemed to listen, to answer her silent call. A second crack of thunder followed, louder, closer, reverberating through the stones beneath the villagers' feet. The sky darkened as if acknowledging the change below. The children froze, merchants dropped their wares, and even the guards who had once held her down felt unease prickling their nerves. The power that had once been invisible, the quiet energy she had nurtured in secret, now demanded attention. It was a storm not only of the air but of presence, a force that recognized its own authority and refused to be ignored. She lifted herself onto trembling legs, no longer kneeling but standing tall, her gaze sweeping the villagers with calm determination. A wind stronger than any the village had seen whipped through the square, tearing banners from posts and rattling shutters. Rain began to fall in sudden, heavy sheets, cooling the sweat of fear that had begun to bead on the villagers' faces. Thunder cracked overhead, each roll resonating with the rhythm of her heartbeat, a drumbeat of impending reckoning. The rival forces, those who had once sneered at her weakness, could not ignore the storm's intensity. The villagers who had mocked, pushed, and ridiculed her found themselves unable to move, their arms lifted instinctively in futile attempts to shield themselves. Even their strongest warriors faltered, unable to comprehend that the source of this tempest was not some god above, but the girl they had underestimated, the one they had called fragile. Lightning danced across the clouds, illuminating the square in jagged flashes. Each bolt seemed to answer her emotions, her anger at injustice, her frustration at mockery, and her determination to reclaim the dignity that had been denied. The storm was not mindless, it moved with intent, striking fear into those who had assumed they held power over her. Every peal of thunder echoed her resolve, a reminder that true strength often lies hidden until the moment of revelation. The villagers began to bow, not in submission to one another but to her. They could not explain why, could not name the force that had overtaken their square, but instinctively they recognized that it was not just a storm of wind and rain. It was the manifestation of something far older, far wiser, far more potent, the awakening of a spirit who had been underestimated for too long. Amid the chaos, she felt the silent witness's presence, acknowledging her achievement, confirming that the storm had not only been unleashed but had been controlled, guided, and shaped by her awareness and courage. She did not raise her voice, she did not shout commands. Her power required no words, no displays of arrogance. It simply flowed, and the village for the first time truly saw her. As the rain fell, drenching faces and soaking the earth, the villagers began to understand. The girl they had mocked was no longer a shadow of weakness, she was the storm incarnate. And with every flash of lightning, every roll of thunder, every gust of wind, they learned the lesson they had refused to accept. Strength is not always visible, courage is not always loud, and sometimes the one you deem weakest carries the mightiest force in existence. The storm did not rage for long, it was precise, controlled, purposeful, but when it passed, the village was forever changed. Their arrogance had been washed away, replaced by a newfound respect and fear. And the girl, standing drenched yet unbroken, had claimed her place, no longer the one who kneels, but the one before whom even the strongest must bow. The square was quiet now, the storm having passed as suddenly as it had arrived. The villagers, soaked, trembling and awestruck, stood in a stunned silence. They no longer laughed, no longer whispered cruel names, no longer pretended that weakness defined the girl who now stood before them. Nalia, once frail and mocked, had transformed in a single unforgettable moment. Her eyes glimmered with the memory of power, and her presence radiated authority that no one dared challenge. She took slow, deliberate steps through the drenched streets, each footfall echoing like a drumbeat of triumph. The air still carried traces of her storm, the scent of rain, the lingering hum of wind, and the residual crackle of thunder, but it was not only the elements that had shifted. The village itself seemed altered, the fear and respect interwoven, forming a new understanding. The people who had scorned her now recognized the truth. Strength is not always measured by muscle, loudness, or dominance. Sometimes, the quiet, underestimated, the meekest among them held the mightiest force. Nalia's hands were damp, her clothes clinging to her from the rain, her hair plastered to her shoulders. Yet she moved with a grace and confidence that contrasted sharply with the trembling villagers. She did not boast, she did not demand acknowledgement, her power needed no display. It had been shown, undeniable and absolute, in the very air, in the sky, and in the trembling hearts of those who had doubted her. They had learned the hard way the consequences of mockery, arrogance, and underestimating what they could not comprehend. The elders stepped forward cautiously, their eyes lowered, their heads bowed, not in submission to the storm, but in recognition of her authority, the authority she had earned through courage, awareness, and patience. They understood now that her weakness had been only a shell, a vessel for something ancient and potent, connected to the wind, the sky, and the old spirits whose whispers had guided her from the beginning. Children, the same ones who had echoed the cruel laughter, stood frozen, watching as the girl who had been the subject of ridicule became the embodiment of the storm itself. Their eyes were wide, their faces bright with awe and confusion, realizing that the girl they had mocked carried a power they could not yet grasp. Nalia's gaze swept over them, not with malice, but with the quiet authority of someone who had endured, learned, and risen above. As she reached the edge of the square, the wind whispered softly around her, carrying the echoes of the storm she had summoned. It was a reminder to all that strength is not always visible, that courage often hides behind a fragile exterior, and that the underestimated may rise when least expected. The villagers would not soon forget this lesson. It was etched into their memories, etched into the very stones of their village, etched into the fabric of the skies above. Nalia lifted her chin, allowing a smile, faint but confident, to touch her lips. The storm that had once been a manifestation of her inner turmoil had now become a symbol of her resilience, her awakening, and her mastery of her own power. Her weakness, once a source of shame and mockery, had transformed into sacredness, a mark of respect, a testament to the depth of what she carried within. The rival clans who had sought to exploit the village's arrogance would think twice before approaching again. The villagers themselves would no longer mock, bully, or demean those who seemed weak or fragile. Tales of Nalia's storm would be passed down, a story of caution, reverence, and inspiration, reminding every generation that appearances are often deceptive, and that even the smallest, quietest child may harbor the mightiest sky. As she walked from the square, her steps measured and unhurried, the villagers remained behind, witnessing her passage with a mixture of fear, respect, and wonder. Nalia had become more than a girl. They realized she was a force, a living storm, a reminder of the power that lies hidden within the underestimated. And in the days, years, and generations to come, her name would be remembered not as the girl they laughed at, but as the storm-bearer, the one whose strength reshaped their world and whose courage taught them the true meaning of power. And so, the girl who had been mocked became legend, not through violence or tyranny, but through the awakening of what had always been hers, the storm inside, fierce, unyielding, and eternal.